Pat.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here. Please excuse my bad wing here. I'm going to try to control my notes and operate this at the same time, so we'll see how good I am at doing two things at once. But I do have several things I want to say. It's going to take a few minutes to get in all these thank yous, so bear with me. For those of you in the chapel tonight, take a moment to consider where you are. This hallowed place was built 165 years ago. Built by free people of color who left their North Carolina and Virginia homes in the 1820s and 1830s for Indiana. Their hopes that this place, Robert's Settlement, and many places like it, might become their promised land. Look around this sanctuary. You are sitting shoulder to shoulder with people you know and people you've just met. Our friends in the community offered other spaces where we could present tonight's program. Places with more space, built-in technology, air conditioning, and cushioned seats. Any other location would have been a lot less work, but none of these other locations offered the significance or the ambiance of our historic chapel. The grounds you may have traversed tonight, the chapel in which you now sit, have been graced by a who's who of black pioneers that through perseverance and determination overcame many obstacles to build a community and establish a legacy of which we are extremely proud. We believe the spirits of our ancestors will be moving among us tonight as we entertain and enlighten ourselves during this panel discussion. We really had one choice for where we would host this panel discussion tonight. It is here at Roberts Chapel. So whether you're sitting in the chapel or viewing remotely, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. This program has been funded by a generous grant from Indiana Humanities. Indiana Humanities is a statewide nonprofit that infuses the humanities into our daily lives. They do this by providing grants, convening discussions, uplifting humanities scholars, spotlighting humanities organizations and activities, and through their own programs, they help Hoosiers think, read, and talk to one another. What are the humanities? History, literature, philosophy and ethics, world languages and cultures, religious studies, archaeology, and other related disciplines are all considered the humanities. Humanities are not one thing, but a process for pursuing truths about a shared human condition. They inspire, engage, and enrich us, allowing us to remember our past, envision our future, and consider ourselves as individuals and members of communities. In essence, the humanities are a study of, participation in, and sharing of the things humans make and the things that make us human. Thank you, George Hanlon and Indiana Humanities for supporting our event tonight. Tonight's program is co-funded by a generous grant from Hamilton County Bicentennial Commission. Come on in and get a seat. By the Bicentennial Commission. Many of you probably know that Hamilton County is having its 200th birthday this year. Brenda Myers and Jessica Petty, if you're in the house, raise your hand. And a host of others throughout the 9 townships of Hamilton County have worked extremely hard to program a years-long celebration. Thank you, Brenda and Jessica, for the financial support and encouragement you always give to us. Brenda, you have assembled an awesome team. Pat Pickett and Carol Sergi, if you're in the room, hold your hand up. They're in the back there. They've been assisting us with our efforts tonight and with our Legacy Walk project. We cannot thank you enough. I would also like to thank my immediate family, my extended Roberts Settlement family, Lavella Hyder, our president, our audio-video team of Stacy White and Kyle Howard in the back corner there, our photographer Ben Rose, our book retailer Expressions Books, that's Donna Stokes Lucas, for being part of the program tonight. We could not have done this without your support. One housekeeping note, there are 2 temporary bathroom stations available on the property. One is located at the front of the chapel on the eastern edge of the parking area. The other is located directly behind the chapel, between our historic loos, or outhouses for those who are less British and more Hoosier. There will be a short Q&A after discussion. We'll do our best to answer as many questions from both the audience that is here and the audience online before we adjourn tonight. When you registered tonight, you should have received an audience survey card. If you didn't, we'll give you one at the end. Your feedback is important to us. Please fill out both sides of the survey card and hand it to one of our ushers as you exit the chapel. After the event concludes tonight, there will be an opportunity to purchase books authored by our panelists. And one person whose book is coming, we'll let her do a plug tonight too. Our panelists will be sticking around in the big tent, provided the weather cooperates, and after the event, they'll be happy to sign their books for you. Finally, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Celeste Williams. Celeste is a journalist, having worked 25 years for daily newspapers in Alabama, Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Indiana. Celeste's play, More Light, Frederick Douglass Returns, was produced in 2017 and 18 at Prairie Interactive History Park in conjunction with Asante Theater. She is a former president of the board of directors at the Writers Center and a volunteer tutor for Bright Lane Learning, which serves children affected by homelessness. I don't have the words to adequately thank my friends, Celeste, for the contributions you make tonight. She's Celeste will be introducing our panelists, but I'd like to extend my thanks to our distinguished panelists and Charnel Peters, who is also quite distinguished, and is part of our bicentennial program. Thank you for being here tonight. Now I will get out of the way and turn the program over to our moderator, Celeste Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone. Despite the weather and the smoke and everything else, thank you for braving the elements to be here. First, I'll introduce our panel. Charlene Fletcher is the Curatorial Director of Prairie Interactive History Park, where she is responsible for historical research. She is also the Emerging Voices Postdoctoral Research Associate in Slavery and Justice at Brown University. Dr. Fletcher's expertise includes the history of race, gender, and the American South. Her soon-to-be-released book, Confined Femininity, Race, Gender, and Incarceration in Kentucky, 1865 to 1920, will be published by Chapel Hill University of North Carolina Press. Welcome, Charlene.
Thank you.
Dr. Warren Milteer is an assistant professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Milteer's extensive research on free people of color has been published in 2 books, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, and North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885. Welcome, Dr. Milteer. Dr. Stephen Vincent is an independent scholar and native son of Noblesville, Indiana. Prior to his retirement, Dr. Vincent was associate professor at University of Wisconsin, Whitewater. He is also the author of Southern Seed, Northern Soil, African American Farm Communities in the Midwest, 1765 to 1900. And it is an essential resource for understanding the history of free people of color who came to Indiana and other Midwest states prior to 1850. Welcome, Stephen. And I'd also like to introduce someone very special to Robert's settlement, Charnel Peters, Dr. Charnel Peters. an assistant professor of race and communication at St. Louis University. Her research and creative work can be found at Text and Performance Quarterly, Communication, Culture, and Critique, Palette Poetry, Indianapolis Review, and elsewhere. And I'd like to welcome Charnel Peters, who is also a descendant of Robert Settlement as well. Charnel.
Thank you so much, Celeste, and thank you, Brian. So I would again like to welcome everyone to this panel. I'm also very excited to learn from Janet about Robert Settlement's history of Indiana and Indiana. So I was asked to give an introduction to this panel. I thought about the two keywords in the title of movement and identity. And I was struck by the way that these words are able to traverse time. I'm back, but louder. So I was struck by the two keywords in the title, movement and identity, and how these words are able to traverse time in such meaningful ways. So the movements we are a part of now happen because of the movements of the past, and the identities of the people in the past inflect and shape our own identities today. So our presence in this very chapel, as Brian was saying, indicates something about the power of someone's movements and someone's identities decades and centuries ago. So when you look up the word movement in the dictionary, you see that movement is the act or the process of being in action, an organized effort to promote or attain an end, a series of organized activities working towards an objective or a goal. And so today we are here to discuss the movements that brought about Robert's settlement, and in that way, we are also discussing the movements that brought each of us here today. As we extend the movements of those in the path and chart new paths forward that those people in the future will be building from as well. So the second key word is identity, and when you look up identity in the dictionary, you get a lot of different things, but a few of the things you see are that it's a distinguishing character or personality of an individual, and the things that cumulatively make us who we are. So we are identified by, and we identify with many, many things. Maybe our families, maybe you too are a descendant of Robert's settlement. Maybe you identify with your hobbies, or maybe you are a Hoosier. Maybe it's a culture that you identify with. So many of these elements constitute our sense of self and who we are. And those things in turn shape how we move through the world. So in that way, movement and identities go hand in hand. Because of who we are, we can question where are we going and where are we moving from. And these are the same questions that we could ask of the people who originally built this chapel. They're the same questions that faced free people of color as they went about their lives. And so I'm struck by the way that we can ask the same questions of ourselves that we ask of people centuries ago, as our panelists will talk about, because the only thing that separates us is time. So I will leave with this found poem that I created from writings about Robert's settlement on the website, and this is called Names of History. It has been said that future generations are bound by this heritage. It has been said that pioneers has become a synonym for the way history took root. Our former homes become uncertain with the struggle of remembering, a symbolic disappearing of time. The place we call history is a gently rolling landscape, and a frontier, and a depth of time to recall. History is a gathering of ideals and aspirations, a log cabin of tenuous freedom, a neighborhood of permanence. History is a dwelling for the pale shadow of fragrance and fear, pursuit and decline. Descendants are the consolidation of decades, a new permanence, a synonym for promise and hope.
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you. Okay, I think we can begin with definitions. What do we mean when we say people of color? How many people in this room would identify as a person of color? Who would? There are quite a few. There's some of you that aren't quite sure. That's okay. That's okay. Perhaps I can ask, what do we mean today, and what did it mean at the founding of our country and into the 19th century and beyond? And I'll start with you, Dr. Milteer.
Okay.
Attack that question.
Yeah, that's
20 words or less. No,
now I'm in trouble. No, I mean, that's a great question. So, of course, I look at this term from a historical standpoint and tend to think about it more from that vantage point. And in many ways, the definition actually hasn't changed as much as people may think. So, from a historical standpoint, this term people of color is used, I think, very much as an inclusive term for a variety of people with a variety of different backgrounds. Mostly, if we're thinking about the historical time period, say the late 1700s, early 1800s, which is the time period I look at, these are people usually of African and or of Native ancestry. But there are also other people in the United States at the time that often don't show up in textbooks. There are people from different parts of Asia in the United States in the 1700s and 1800s, and often they are also categorized as people of color, which is what we see today. And I think for those people who see people of color as controversial today, which it has now become, I think, it is that broader definition that I think people aren't as comfortable with. But historically, I see a lot of continuity between today and the past.
Okay. No, I would notice that these days, the term people of color you think of as everyone who is not white is a person of color.
Right.
Now, that would be different back at the founding of the country and into the 1800s as well, the definition of people of color. How was it different? I don't know if Stephen, you want to
tackle that
a little bit as well?
Well, I think you have to go back to the origins of, remember America, the America we were talking about.
Yeah.
This is early Virginia, early North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And English colonists were working their way through how to deal with the transition to slavery, slave exploitation. And at the same time, Native Americans are being dispossessed of their land in North Carolina and Virginia. And the South as a whole is shifting towards becoming, rather than being a society with slaves, we're becoming a slave society. And so what do you do with people who don't quite fit the sort of categories that are being established? And people of color are part of that. We talked a little bit earlier about, one of the important things is just to realize that America wasn't a nation that was just black and white as we know it, but of lots of shades. And the words that we take for granted, like Negro, having a certain meaning, had a different set of meanings early on. To be a Negro was a synonym of slavery. You were a slave, so Southern whites would refer to their Negroes. But that Negro might be an Indian slave, might be a white slave.
So the categorization, one thing I noticed in your most recent book, Dr. Milteer, you said that the categorization of people is something that the dominant culture needed to do in order to establish their dominance. Is that, Charlene, is that something that you would agree with as well?
I would, and you see it codified. Oh, sorry.
That's good.
A little loud there. I would agree with that, and it's something that you see codified in early Virginia, and you see that replicated in various other colonies, whether they're southern or northern colonies. And so you see this differentiation between, of course, enslaved, but also indentured. And so racially based slavery becomes a quote-unquote thing in the 1600s in spaces like early Virginia. And not only is it racially based, but this is where you see the codification of enslavement through the line of the mother, right? But I think that the terms, people of color, it does serve as this broader definition of groups of people, but also understand that those categories fluctuate, not just through the 19th century, but even into the early 20th century, because what we may consider even to be, we're talking about people of color, but what we may consider to be white in the 20th and 21st century also evolves. And so those who are coming into the country, the Irish, Italians, Eastern Europeans, they become white. And so those definitions or those identities, they are also fluctuating over the course of American history.
Interesting. So when we add free to people of color, what does free mean? When we were talking about free people of color, does freedom merely mean the absence of slavery or servitude? What define free when it comes to, we're talking about free people of color? Dr. Milteer, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it, that's primarily the difference is the absence of slavery, legal personhood. Now, there are all kinds of legal personhood. There's a spectrum within freedom as far as like rights. Are you poor? Are you rich? All of those different things. So,
who was defining what freedom meant? Who was it that was defining the meaning of freedom?
I mean, I think to some degree lawmakers are doing that. To some degree, courts are doing that. I mean, other people within, there are people who could see themselves as free outside of the law. That's not impossible. But from where I'm focusing, I tend to pay attention to the legal definitions because it has these longer repercussions for people, even if they may see themselves in a different way.
Okay. So how did those definitions serve the social order of the time? It seemed to be a fluid thing, depending on who was defining what freedom meant for certain people. How did those definitions serve the social order of the time?
Right. I mean, I think in the context of slavery, of course, it upholds, property rights and human beings.
Right.
I think that's probably the most important part.
Right. You have anything else?
I will defer more.
Okay. Did free people of color, because they were considered free, did they consider themselves higher or better than those who were enslaved? Or did they think themselves in the same category?
I mean,
Is that a hard question?
That's a really hard question.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah,
How many
I
days do
realize
we
that.
have?
Right. I don't think it's as cut and dry as an issue of class.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that would go into that. There may be regional influences. I mean, you see in certain spaces in the South, where you have free people of color who own other people of color. And just as an example of that, yeah, you can definitely see it in a space like Charleston, South Carolina. But I think that in a space, it's going to vary based on the space, but I also think that even though you have this position of being free, it goes back to your original question, what is freedom? What does that look like? What does that mean? And so in a space like Indiana, you know, I tell people all the time, Indiana loves to tell this story that it's a free state. It loves to tell that story. And even when you're sitting in, you know, social studies classes, I grew up here. I grew up in Indianapolis, and when I was 17, I left. You know, and so growing up here, you're constantly given that narrative of Indiana as a free state. Indiana was second to Delaware in the number of volunteers that served in the Civil War. And so it perpetuates this idea that this was a safe space. And there are free people of color living here. But when you really look at life in the state at the time, it was not, it wasn't rainbows and sunshine. There were laws that prohibited the movement of these free people, right? There were laws that were put in place that required black people to register and to pay bonds upward of, you know, $500. $500 is a lot of money right now. So you can imagine that law was passed in 1831. And so when we think about what it means to be free, or we think about freedom, it goes back to your original question, what exactly is this? And where you are and how you're experiencing that freedom is, it's not a monolithic experience. So while there may have been black people in this space who were free, trust and believe there were still limitations on that freedom. So that's why I say that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how you approach it,
Right.
or how you consider those elements. We could probably be here for a while.
Right. Well, going back to North Carolina, that's where the people who settled here, Roberts, came from. What were some of the motivations for them to leave, where they had, for a time, they had some freedom. They were able to vote even. They were able to have many of the trappings of a free life. And of course, there are things that happened that caused them to wonder if they would remain so. Like the Nat Turner Rebellion happened, and explain what happened after that. And yeah.
Well, you know, you get back to this issue of free and unfree, and
Yeah.
how free people of color that we know interact. When the group of people that we know as free people of color emerged, you know, there was a sort of growth during the colonial era of people who became free by many different reasons. But one of the main was white servant women having children with first generation African slaves. And the rights those people had, you know, clearly they were unfree. If a white servant woman had a child, the son or daughter spent the first 31 years of their life as an indentured servant. And if you realize that lifespans only went to 40 years, roughly, you know, you're pretty much spending your life in a state of unfreedom. Whereas your children, in the case of, say, the Robertses, they became free and were able to get their land. Ownership of land was a sort of, granted them a sort of control over their destiny in a way that it wouldn't been for most white or blacks, who were not own, you know, who didn't own land.
Yeah.
But in terms of getting to the migration, you know, the conditions that a lot of the conditions that they faced in North Carolina and Virginia were face-to-face relation, which was acquired through face-to-face relationships. This is a rural society where everybody knows everybody. And as Warren has written, there were opportunities that existed for free people of color in the colonial period, very early, right after the Revolution, that weren't available over time. I mean, the overall trajectory was one of, as slavery became a more and more definitive element of Southern society as a whole, free people of color became less accepted, not just at the formal level, but at the informal level as well. So migration was an opportunity to go elsewhere where they would have more control.
Right, right. So, Dr. Milteer, I know what were the people thinking in terms of, are we going to leave or are we going to stay? I can't imagine that they really knew what was in store for them, you know, when they moved west, and, you know, Indiana being the West back then.
Right.
How did they make those decisions, whether they were going to leave, you know, a place they had been their entire lives, to come to, you know, what was basically a wilderness at that time?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that, you know, maybe the earliest generations of people who came west were gambling to some degree, but as, you know, once you get a few people from your community coming to a place like Indiana from North Carolina, they have networks. People write to each other and talk about their experiences in Indiana. They talk about the pluses and minuses of moving to a place like Indiana or Ohio or Michigan or wherever they're going. And as time goes on, you know, people are better informed about what the possibilities are here. For some people, they're considering financial possibilities, getting a piece of land and starting a farm that they may not be able to, you know, may not be able to do that same thing in North Carolina. Other people may be concerned about the legal situation in North Carolina and how things are declining politically. There are other people who I suspect come out here because they're running from the law, you know, and they're, you know, trying to find a way out. So there are a lot of different motivations for people. People want to reunite with family members. So, you know, a brother goes out west, then another brother goes, a sister goes, and people, you know, start following their relatives and they're trying to reconnect. So there are a lot of different reasons, I think, that would have brought people to the west of the time.
Yeah.
You know, they would have known where they didn't want to go,
Yeah.
which was the pattern of migration from Northampton County was directed primarily towards Alabama and Mississippi. That was clearly not a possibility that they wanted to embrace.
Right.
On the other hand, this is a face-to-face society. They are on good terms with their Quaker neighbors. And for that evangelical Methodist, for a very brief moment of time in the 1780s, was at the leadership level, was opposed to slavery. And the ground zero for Methodism in America was the North Carolina-Virginia line, close to where the Robertses lived. So, you know, they knew that there were certain white people who could be trusted, or they knew that their acceptance level was going to be greater. I mean, Quakers were not a magical people. They had lots of flaws, and if you look at their records, you can see they struggled internally with how they treated the people that they had enslaved. And were legally bound. We're not allowed to free them, but you know, the Quaker minutes read pretty, you know, clearly that there were, you know, they lost a lot of their members over the issue of slavery, and because they couldn't make that leap.
Yeah.
But they knew at least the ones who came to the Midwest were going there based on their religious beliefs, but also on their belief in the equal, in the inner soul, that we are all equal.
So were they running away or running to?
No, they moved to Northampton in the first place for the opportunities they wouldn't have
Okay.
gotten on the south
Okay.
side of Virginia.
Yeah.
And they moved to Indiana because they knew that there were opportunities economically,
Yeah.
and that there might be a way to make that transition.
Yeah.
I mean, they were well aware of.
What was happening legislatively in North Carolina at that time? Were there things legally that was threatening their livelihoods, their levels of freedom in North Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the time, and to some degree, it depends on the individual and how they see their connection with the law, right? So,
And frankly, white people saw what Nat Turner did, and
Right.
they reacted pretty quickly legislatively to that. Did they not?
They did to some degree, and I write about the Nat Turner Rebellion a little bit in one of my books, and the way I put it is the discriminatory ideas that get put into law after the rebellion are not new.
Yeah.
So the rebellion is a political opportunity to pass ideas that they could not pass before.
Okay.
And so that's what you're seeing going on, because you can look in the legislative record and there's certain things like, for instance, restrictions on ministers of color preaching. Like these aren't new ideas that came about in 1831 because of Nat Turner. This is something that actually people have been trying to do before, and then when the Turner Rebellion takes place, the legislature is like, oh, we have to do something, we have to respond to this, and they throw out a variety of ideas. And what you see is some ideas make it, some of them still can't pass after 1831 and the Nat Turner Rebellion. So yeah, that's the way.
Explain to people who a little bit more about what the rebellion was with Nat Turner.
Yeah, so I mean, the rebellion took place in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. Southampton County is directly north of Northampton County, North Carolina, which is where a lot of people who ended up in the Roberts settlement came from. And so during that rebellion, you had a group of enslaved people headed by Nat Turner, who went around and basically they killed a lot of people, and they were rebelling against slavery. And what the purpose was for that, I think, has been interpreted a lot of different ways. Some people see it more as something that's religiously motivated. Some people see it more as something that is, strictly about these interactions between enslaved people and their enslavers, and the, long-term negative effects of those relationships. But whatever the cause may be, for those particular individuals, it has a greater impact because, to some degree, it's closer to success than what had been seen before, because there's always people rebelling against slavery. There are many instances in which you'll see in the court records in North Carolina, Virginia, where enslaved people will kill their masters, poison their masters. That's nothing new by 1831. It's just the number of people who were involved in the rebellion and the number of people they were able to kill compared to some previous rebellions that I think sparks a lot of attention.
I think it's important to know we think about Nat Turner, but there, like you said, there were other rebellions prior to, and one of the things that really, one of the largest rebellions that really serves as a catalyst for a lot of these ideas, whether it's a galvanizing inspiration for people of color, but then also the response of various legislatures, is the Haitian Revolution. And we often, when we think about this period, the age of revolutions, we know about the American Revolution. The French then have a whole host of issues with the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise, but Haiti becomes the first black nation in the Western Hemisphere in 1804. And that stirred up a lot of legislatures to respond, to act. And so you see other revolutions, or even if it's what we would consider to be a small scale revolt, there's this larger idea of freedom and fighting for freedom. And even if after Haiti establishes herself, she then goes into South America to liberate others. And so there is this constant conversation about, again, what is freedom? And so it again, like you said, it doesn't start in 1831. This is a long-standing push in terms of revolution, but then also response from enslaving interests, be they British, be they French, be they what would become America.
Yeah, yeah. So, bringing it to where we are here at the Robert settlement. Stephen, when you did a lot of research, obviously, before your book came out. What did you find in your research that people found when they got here?
When they got here.
And were they?
Yeah, I think, what they got out,
Yeah.
in part, not just because of the response to Nat Turner
Sure.
politically or legally, but
Sure.
again, it's a face-to-face society.
Yeah.
They had, I remember there's a trial in Northampton in the 1790s. 2 slaves were convicted of killing a slave owner, and the punishment for these 2 slaves was not to just behead them, but to behead them and put their heads on spikes on public display. And if you lived in a society where a majority of people around you are slaves, you've got a lot to worry about.
Yeah.
And so they knew, at least by coming to Indiana, they knew that in Northampton County is adjacent. And there is a interesting in Robert's Hook is that Nat Turner rounded up his supporters, but he also drew in free blacks who had not fared well, including a member of the Newsom family. I think there was also maybe an archer. There were people who were mixed race. So coming to Indiana was at least a way to escape that initial hostility. We know that beach settlement, which is kind of the precursor to Roberts, was settled in a really fast, compressed fashion. And so what they're trying to escape is that intolerance of white people, and part of what they hoped to find, not only, first of all, it's great soil and land that allowed them to prosper as farmers, but an environment of people around them that was going to be more tolerant than what they found. And that was somewhat true. It certainly was true in the Quakers.
Yeah.
So they had that aspiration of gaining greater control.
Uh-huh. What were they surprised to find when they got here?
They weren't surprised.
No.
They had an inkling of what they were going to find.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I mean, Indiana is, Indiana, particularly southern Indiana, is settled primarily by Northerners by Southerners from North Carolina and Virginia. They knew what they were going to find. They were going to find the same people, but in a free state, who were going to be intolerant.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your personal histories. Dr. Milteer, I understand that you started researching these things when you were, what, 12?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, curious about my family and, people who I didn't know who I'd heard about, and trying to learn more about them. And so I got to work. I started researching my family, and what you find out, I have ancestors, of course, who were free people of color, including some from Northampton County, North Carolina. And what you find out is that your family is connected to other families, and those families are connected to others, and you start to see these networks of families. And I think that got me started with thinking about this topic of free people of color, not just as family research, but it's a larger historical project. They're trying to understand those networks and how people fit together. And so, of course, my childhood genealogical interest ended up becoming an academic interest, first through, undergrad, grad school, and, here I am now.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, you, Stephen, how did you come?
Yeah, how did I boy?
Nice,
Where did I come into this picture?
Yeah, nice little,
No, I
little
just
boy from
I grew up
Noblesville,
in
Indiana.
a poorly educated boy from Noblesville, Indiana. But I didn't know what I was going to do when I went to college. But I took an early. What I knew about the African American community in Noblesville was somewhat limited. But I do remember admiring Murphy White, and good history begins with good questions. And how did Murphy White get to be a city councilman in a city or a town that was 95% white? So I kind of knew from that, and I knew that Robert settlement was a place that existed. I know that the Glovers and the Whites had these connections. One of my first history courses in college was about free people of color in the North that stressed how bad things were, particularly in cities. And so my question was, what made Robert's settlement different? How did they get to where they were? And especially in light of knowing that generally free people of color had very little opportunity in certain settings, in urban settings, on the wharves on the Ohio River. But these people somehow really stood out. And so it was a simple question. This question I keep asking. So.
Interesting. About you, Charlene?
I knew at 6 that I wanted to be a historian.
Really?
Because I watched, don't laugh, I watched Sesame Street, Don't Eat the Pictures. And it's a cute little movie where Big Bird and Snuffy, they get stuck in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Long story short, they meet this little ancient Egyptian boy, and he's got to get back to his parents. But I remember asking my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, if in the movie ancient Egyptians allegedly believed that you would become a star in the afterlife. And I remember asking my grandmother, Granny, is that true? And she said, I don't know, but we can go find out. And she took me to, at that time it was a black bookstore inside of Zion Hope Baptist Church on 46th Street in the city. And she bought me books that were well beyond my reading level for a 6-year-old. But I kept those books and began just asking questions, and she encouraged my questions. And so that's how I knew then that I wanted to be a historian. But life took me in other places. I worked in the criminal justice system. I ran prison programs. I lived in New York City. But in terms of my research, I am a historian, yes, race, gender, the South, but also of crime. And so my research questions focus specifically on the ways in which black women have been confined, particularly in places like Kentucky. And that's where my mother's people are from. My father's people are from Mississippi. And so my parents came to Indiana as children, my mother in the 60s, my father in 58. He was born in Chicago, but my grandparents were part of that second wave of the Great Migration. And so in thinking about, black folks who were coming from North Carolina, from Virginia in the 19th century, why they came, it's the same reasons as why my grandparents found their way to Indianapolis, right? And so my research focuses on Kentucky because, one, that's where my mother's family was enslaved. We were not free people of color on either side of my family, just full stop. Even after emancipation, I have the domestic contracts for the grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, who would have continued to occupy white homes in Louisiana and Mississippi. And so this idea of freedom for them, even though the war had ended, was still very far off. And in places like Kentucky, that were not subject to Reconstruction because it did not secede from the Union, you still have children that are enslaved as late as 1868, and they're being sold as late as 1868. And so my interest really grew over the years, knowing that I loved history, but then also working in the criminal justice system and seeing those parallels between prison and enslavement. And so that's what I write about now.
Okay. I'm interested in how, as a museum leader, in terms of interpretation, how do you approach interpreting some hard truths, some things that are not easy to answer? You know, everything doesn't have a hard and fast answer in history. How do you approach those things?
My goal as a historian is to just tell the truth. And my approach usually is different from what other museum professionals have an interest in. You have to have these hard conversations. You have to. Because if you don't, we're going to continue to see certain things unfolding in this country. This country is never going to get to where it needs to be until we have these conversations. And I think that it's pertinent for museum professionals to move in that direction because museums are trusted spaces. People trust what they glean out of a museum more than what they do in the public school system, period, any district in this country. And so my approach is to do just that. And I ruffle feathers. I ruffle a lot of feathers. But if you know me, you know I don't mind ruffling said feathers. Because it's important, not only to present this truth, but you can't dilute it or conflate it with fiction. Or this narrative of, this narrative of American exceptionalism. And my goal is not to do that, but to also ensure that we talk about safe spaces. It's important to have brave spaces. Safe is, that's relative. You have to have brave spaces, and museums need to be brave spaces in order to engage the history and in order to engage these conversations.
Okay. Dr. Milteer, how important, and also for you, Stephen, how important is what you do and what you research to what our conversations are today? You've written a lot of history. How important are those things to what we were talking about in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in order to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And the more you understand about the past, then you have a better idea of why things operate the way they do now. Because sometimes people, I see people theorize about why things are the way they are now without a historical context. It's like, read the history and you'll know why things are the way they are. Some things that seem new are not so new. Especially if you think about politics. They are not new at all. And so I think that by learning about the experiences of free people of color, looking at the things they were able to accomplish, but also the challenges, that you get a better sense of why things are the way they are today. And going back to your earlier question about freedom, I think that we have this imaginary idea of what freedom is, that there's this pinnacle, there's something that we're reaching for that is called freedom, right? But I think if you look at the experiences of the people I study and look at our experiences today as so-called free people, they vary quite a bit, right? Some of us have great opportunities in certain ways, others of us struggle. Access for all of us is not the same, and that's how it was back in the past too. And so I think when people make that connection, then they start to understand or want to ask why, and you can figure out why by looking at history.
Thank you. Now, I'm sure many of you have questions as well. I think we can open that up now. Who's got the microphone? Somebody has the microphone. Lavella has the microphone. Maybe.
Yes, Deidre.
Hi,
can
thank
stand.
you. Oh,
It's-
hi, I'm Dee Thornton, and I have a question for, and I'm sorry, you're the historian from Noblesville?
Stephen.
Stephen, you said you were inquisitive about the Roberts settlement and just everything about it, which was part of your reason for really starting to discover and learn the history. Particularly with Murphy White, how he was able to be elected in a county that was 96% white. So what were the three things that you found that made that possible for him to achieve that?
Oh, for Murphy. Murphy was a fighter. Um, Murphy was a character, but, I know he wrote letters to the Noblesville Ledger during World War II, talking about the rights he had as a soldier, that he could have a position and back at home. He didn't have that, so Murphy, I don't know, that's a long question about what, Murphy, I don't, it kind of opened up a whole lot of questions, it's like, why is Murphy so different, and why is then the Noblesville, the African Americans that I knew in Noblesville, I like to tell the story that Brian and I went to kindergarten together, but and I never would have done research on Robert's settlement if it hadn't been for the support I got from, I think Deidre White was in my class at the high school, and so there just seemed to be a lot of unraveling of how we got to that point. And Noblesville wasn't a wonderful place for African Americans in a lot of ways, but somehow he found a space that he could operate in.
Hi, my name is Adriana Brown. So we talked earlier about what the term people of color means, and I kind of wanted to go deeper into that and to ask any of you what you believe the term African American means. Because for a lot of people in America, like Asian Americans, Latino Americans, they're all very connected and grounded to their roots. But, I feel like a lot of black people in the room probably agree that, we don't really have a connection to our African roots because of slavery. So how is that term kind of evolving throughout the years? And do you think that term is a little maybe systematic in a way, or how do you think that term African American is evolving?
Well, we've been called many things.
Right. One of the things that I see doing research, and I'm sure Warren would probably agree, is that this is a learning opportunity to talk to students or audiences in general about how these terms, where they came from and how they've evolved. And I know I was looking at Northampton County records, and in 1821 I came across a land deed, and in the inscription the recorder had put an FN period. And that was the first time I'd seen reference to race inside a court document. But that FN was for free Negro. It wasn't for free person of color. It was at a time, and the person the deed was for was somebody who was mixed race. It was a Robert's ancestor.
Well, there were many.
But we
So
tend to
there were many so-called people of color that didn't have any African descent. Isn't that
Yeah.
true, Dr. Milteer? So, and I noticed in one of your books, you basically said these categories were put in place because of people's natural tendencies to want to categorize life. And so people were put into these categories. So I don't know if you want to try to answer this question. It's not an easy
I
one.
mean, I think it's rooted in when we started, we talked about movement, but we also talked about identity. And identity is fluid. You have folks who, in thinking about the term African American, we don't have those connections because we don't know. But what we do know is that there's this singular landmass where we do come from. But I think that as you move further into the 20th and 21st centuries, folks are comfortable with being, some of us are still comfortable being African American. I personally identify as black. I am black. I do too, full stop, because I don't know. We can take ancestry DNA tests and all those other things, or what's 23andMe, and it can give us these ideas as to where on the continent our ancestors originate. But when it does, it's still by colonial definition. Ghana becomes Ghana in 1957. It doesn't tell you if you are Asante. It doesn't tell you if you are Yoruba. And so it says you're Nigerian. Well, that wasn't a thing when the Middle Passage was in existence. And so to say black, you also have to consider that as those ships left ports, they didn't come directly here. Your ancestors could have very well made their first stop in a place like Jamaica. They could have then went to Antigua. They could have then went to Haiti before docking in a place like Charleston or Baltimore or New York. So we don't know. And I think that when you just, for me, it's more of a connection with other spaces in the diaspora. I know on my father's side, some of my ancestors are Haitian. I know that outright. But where on the continent are they from? With whom did they mingle? Because we were all just put together in this space. I think that that's a piece of it. The other half of that, that's the African side. The other half of that is American. Some of us don't feel like we are treated like Americans, is what it is. And so, W.E.B. Du Bois, we were talking about W.E.B. Du Bois earlier, when we talk about the idea of double consciousness, where you are not black enough to be African, but you're too black to be an American. And so with that in mind, it goes back to the whole notion of identity and what it is that as an individual and your experience as this person of color or as a black person, how does that resonate with you? Because, and I say this all the time, black people are not monolithic. We do not have the same experiences across the board. And it doesn't make a difference if you were born and raised in the United States, if you were born and raised in the United Kingdom or some other place that has been touched by colonialism. We have a lot of experiences and cultural iterations that we share, but that doesn't mean that we have the same experience. And so I think that over time, stop calling me Negro. I'm an Afro-American. That becomes African-American. But as we think broadly about the context of the diaspora, you'll see more folks who just identify straight to the point, I'm black. And I'm definitely one of those people, so I share that with you.
Who's got the mic? Where's our mic holder? There she is.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. My name is Don Thornton. I have a question for the panel. And my question is, and in your research, Do you believe that there will ever be another Black Wall Street?
It's possible. I don't know if the statistic still stands that black people are the largest spenders in the United. I don't know if that still holds true. At one point it did. I think that it's possible, but just as much as it is possible for it to exist, the reason why Black Wall Street was destroyed is still ever present. So that's the best answer I can give you. Anything is possible, but the threats that we have are still ever present in these United States.
Hi, I'm Leslie Davis. I've often been curious, we know about the migration to Indiana and Robert's settlement and the success that happened here, among other Midwestern farming communities, but Dr. Milteer, I'm curious. There's many that stayed behind. So the Civil War breaks out. What measures did they employ for self-preservation? I know a number were successful doctors and lawyers. So what were they doing during this time period?
So during the Civil War, specifically?
Well, yes, as the slave rebellions were breaking out in
Right.
the Civil War, were they joining Union regiments or Confederate regiments? What was
Right.
happening?
Yeah, so a lot is going on. Yeah, there are definitely free people in North Carolina who joined Union regiments after January of 1863, because the coast of North Carolina is taken back over by the United States Army. And so people will flock from the interior of North Carolina to the east, and many of them enlist. Before that, it depends. Now, a lot of young men in particular are being impressed into the Confederate service. They are doing hard labor as ditch diggers, trench diggers. They are keeping up with all the horses that the military has. They're cooking. You do have a few women who are also being pulled into those positions as well in North Carolina. People are trying to preserve what they have during the war, so people are trying to get exemptions from that type of service so that they can keep their farm up. I mean, you can't keep a farm up if nobody's there, right? It's really hard to do that. So people are trying to figure out any way possible to keep some type of stability in their lives during the Civil War specifically. That seems to be what I'm finding. There are a couple of instances where there are free people who enlist in the Confederate service as soldiers, but they are enlisting as white. So when you're doing that, you are, presumed to be white. There are a couple of people who are, for lack of words, found out and kicked out of that army later on because they don't meet the definition of white. But I would say that there's a much larger percentage of people who are either just trying to stay out of the way, or they end up supporting the U.S. Army in some form or fashion.
Yeah, I think specifically, I think there's a lot of, once the Union takes control in 1863, I think there's a specific artillery unit. I mean, the Union finds ways right away, but
But their families, how did they hold on?
Yeah,
Their family unit, how did they held on?
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things I've observed, for instance, in maybe the more interior parts of North Carolina, just to focus on North Carolina, what will happen is you would have young men go to the East Coast, they join the military, and then sometimes their families will come out there with them in the camps. Wives, children, cousins end up coming out there, and they try to, continue their family life on the military bases or out in the fields.
So-
You see some of that.
I believe it's Tavolia Glimpf, a historian. She just published a book, and I cannot call the name of it right now, but she writes about the experiences of black women and children in contraband camps that are attached to Union regiments during the war. Hopefully the name will come to me. The title of the book will come to me before we leave here, but and it's a fairly recent book that speaks to those experiences.
Okay, I'm Johnny Davis, Leslie's husband. Steve, I would like to ask you to talk about manumission papers and as it relates to slaves getting free or being mobile. Along with that, if you could address the one-drop rule as it relates to being, black or African American or whatever. Dr. Milteer, I'd like to ask you, today, the historical Supreme Court judgment related to college applications and its implications going forward. And then finally, Dr. Charlene, I'd like to ask you about Roe versus Wade.
Have mercy.
Who wants
Well,
to start?
One of the things to be aware of is that there is actually a brief moment in time in the mid-1780s as the Constitution is getting worked out, this details, there is actually a manumission movement that leads to an expansion of the number of African Americans in the early South. That's kind of the upper South today. So there is that broadening of manumission. So there's actually and that makes the African American, the free people of color a much more diverse group than before. In terms of, are you thinking in terms of the regulations, in terms of free papers? It was essential for, for a person of color who's free to always have free papers. I mean, the incidence of kidnapping of free people of color are really shocking. If you looked at the number, I was counting on some list that I had related to Virginia and North Carolina, and there are at least 50 documented cases of people of color being kidnapped. So free papers of color, and it's amazing how families kept those papers generation after generation. When people from this area applied for a portion of the Eastern Cherokee funds in 1908. So that's we're talking 150 years beyond the Civil War, or 50 years beyond the Civil War, but they brought out the papers of their grandparents with great pride. The statement, "We have never been slaves," was commonplace, and the proof of that was considered those free papers. The flip side, I guess, you might be getting at is that states in the South, the more that we become there is no place in the minds of whites for people who are black and free over time. And so everything that can be done to limit the size of the free color, or to limit the size and to try to control free people of color, that sort of idea increases over time, so that states like Indiana require Negroes to free Negroes terminology at the time, to register, to put on record who they are. In a way that was meant to discourage people from even coming to Indiana and keep them out. For genealogists today, they're a godsend because you've got records of a lot of these documents will explain how people became free and who their ancestors were. So there's that. The one-drop rule is another side. It's just we didn't invent, the United States did not invent slavery, but we had to make a system that worked in our country. And a lot of that was, what do you do with people who have intermixed one way or another with Africans who are lighter skinned? And the original formulation was the idea that you couldn't, a free person of color could not be considered white until if they had any African ancestry to the 4th generation. You know, you got to keep that door shut. And ultimately, the ultimate thing of that is the one drop, that gets extended further and further to what becomes the one drop rule, which is if you have any inkling, any sign that you're African American, you are African American. The one, I did come across a reference that was interesting in the Eastern Cherokee claims, where the guy said that we must have been a really powerful people if just one drop. It takes 99% of those whites, you know, but just that one drop. But, you know, that was just a sign of America created a, you know, the Native American population in North Carolina and officially, in a way, ceases to exist in the eyes of white officials until after the Civil War. And you begin to get this emergence of black community, school or Indian schools, Pembroke College.
Does that include the Lumbee Nation?
Yeah, yeah. But, you know, Indians were always Indians. They had their churches, they had their private schools, but, you know, in the eyes of white Americans, you were either white or you were black. And that's, you know, that's a lot of, you know, we still live with a lot of that.
Okay, Johnny, was that your first question?
That was
Yeah.
the first question.
That was answered?
Next came affirmative action.
Oh, man. Look, I was too busy preparing for this talk today to get ready for that that question. No, I really haven't read much about it, so I probably should not comment about something that I haven't read. I know, the black and white of it, but that's about it. I've not read the details. I don't know what the number of people who voted one way or another, so I could not. 6-3. Okay.
Yeah.
Usual suspect.
Right.
That's
But
all
anyway,
I know.
right. But yeah, I can't go any further
And
than
Roe
that.
versus
Intelligent.
Wade, Charlene, oh my God.
I needed an easier question, like the manumission question.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm with you, because Roe versus Wade, that's loaded. I mean, I don't know where you want me to start with that. I mean, Roe versus what? We knew that, much like affirmative action, we knew that was coming. Just with this ultra-conservative push, but I would say that when it comes to Roe versus Wade, there is this, and I'm not sure this is going to answer your question, but I'm just going to throw it out there and you tell me what you think in terms of, a satisfactory answer. We look at Roe versus Wade as this cornerstone for reproductive rights. And there is a difference between a fight for reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I say that because typically when you're thinking of reproductive rights, you're only looking at the issue from a legal basis. And that legal basis oftentimes speaks to the needs of white women. But when you're talking about reproductive justice, it is a holistic approach to a woman having control over her own body. And not just the legal right to her body, but do you have access to quality health care, whether it be your regular checkups or whether it's maternal and infant health care. And in this country, one of the things that we consistently see that black women are plagued with, specifically black women, are high rates of maternal mortality, as well as when it comes to our children, infant mortality. And so it's one thing to have the right to abortive care. It's another to have an entirely holistic approach to reproductive justice. Can I have access to this care? The doctors that I will see, do they see me as human? because we still in the 21st century have issues where there are doctors in this country who do not think that black people receive or experience pain in the way that white folks do. That's very real. And so with that being said, are you getting the care and the attention that you need? But when we're talking about reproductive justice, it's specific to women of color. And so when we look at Roe versus Wade and the repeal of Roe versus Wade, black women could have told you that was coming, because we have told you that was coming. You see that through the women's rights movements at the turn of the century in the 1960s, 1970s. You see that. But Roe versus Wade is just, one corner, one element of these issues surrounding reproductive rights. But the larger question, the larger issue is reproductive justice. And so there's a larger fight, there's a larger question that needs to be engaged and continues to be engaged.
Yes. Hello, my name is Regina Mack, and I found out recently in the last few years that I'm a descendant of free people of color from Northampton County in North Carolina, as well as free people of color from the Virginia area, in particularly Henrico County. Dr. Milteer, I have a question. I want to make sure I understand. Did you mention earlier that some free people of color from Virginia migrated to North Carolina, or was it the other way around? And if so, what was the purpose of that migration, with both of those states being considered Southern? Or I thought I had read some time ago that maybe Virginia was kind of on the part of it may have been not as considered as much a part of the South as some of the other states. Could you clarify that for me, please?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of movement between Virginia and North Carolina. There, especially in the colonial period, you have a lot of people leaving Virginia, going into North Carolina. There's opportunities to get land, things like that. On the border region of Virginia and North Carolina, though, you do often see a lot of back and forth movement. People will move for a variety of different purposes. Work is often a motivator. People are trying to change their status as far as the law is concerned in those border regions. But yeah, there are definitely a lot of historical connections between those two states. And of course, those connections then expand out to places like Indiana, Ohio, where large numbers of the free people of color, they have connections to Virginia and North Carolina.
Kentucky too.
Yeah.
Kentucky
sure.
too. Kentucky was a part of Virginia until it entered the Union in 1792. Kentucky was Kentucky County, Virginia. And then it broke up into 3 counties: Fincastle, Fayette, and Jefferson. With Jefferson is Louisville, Fayette is Lexington. And then as the state enters the Union, more counties bloom out of that. But that might speak to the question of Virginia as Southern. Yes, it's always Southern, but Kentucky at that time is considered the West.
In the early time period too, Virginia is the big colony. Mm-hmm. It is the colony until Charleston takes off. And North Carolina is just this backwater that, it's partly because of that there are limits to settlement. And so the general drift of settlement from Virginia overall. So the very first free black population gets generated primarily in Virginia because that's where the settlement begins. But it follows the same sort of pattern of free whites resettle. I mean, the frontier is North Carolina. So
We'll stay with Dr. Fletcher. I would like to ask you a question. I'd like to hear about your work at Connor Prairie. And from what I see and read, how you're transforming, and not just you, but many are transforming the way the story is being told about the Indiana pioneer period and things like that. So maybe you could briefly share with us some of the great work that you're doing there at Connor Prairie.
I've done my best. I've been at Conner Prairie for about 2 years now as Curatorial Director, and I was hired to curate a new exhibit called Promised Land is Proving Ground. And the exhibit itself, first of all, this is Conner Prairie's first true effort in terms of exhibiting African American history in an accurate and respectful way. If you are familiar with Conner Prairie, there's this long history with the program Follow the North Star. We can talk about that later. But Promised Land is Proving Ground is not that. The exhibit covers over 500 years of history from pre-colonial Africa to the present day. One, because you have to have an understanding of how people are migrating to this space that we call Indiana. But then also understanding that we are still here in the state of Indiana and still leaving our mark just as our ancestors did in this time, in this space at various time periods. The exhibit will physically have a soft opening in the fall, and there will be a formal opening in 2024. And it has really changed the way that Conner Prairie, I forced Conner Prairie to change the way it does business, quite frankly. And so, yeah, I told you I ruffle feathers. So this exhibit is really rooted in technology. And so if you've never been to Conner Prairie, for those of you who are not from central Indiana, Conner Prairie is similar in many ways to Colonial Williamsburg, where you have first-person interpretation. Folks are costumed and they engage with you as if it is a specific historical time period. And for many of the spaces at Conner Prairie, there was no electricity. It was really set up as if it was a small 1836 village. And so now there's electricity in said village, and touch screens, and there's an augmented reality experience where folks can come in and they use their devices, or you can check out a device and you can actually meet actual Black Hoosiers who were historical figures. Folks like Lucy Higgs Nichols, who was a Civil War nurse attached to the 23rd Indiana, and she eventually settled in New Albany. Benjamin Talbot was a blacksmith who lived in Logansport. He was actually one of the first blacksmiths in Cass County, which is up north, and his land, he had quite a bit of it, but piece by piece it was taken by white folks. And the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced him to make the decision to leave the state of Indiana out of fear of safety for him and his family. And he never returned to Indiana. He actually settled and died in Toledo, Ohio. But much of this exhibit, it's not just me. It was rooted in community. The Asante Art Institute of Indianapolis is a key partner. Folks like community elders like Anthony Artist, Babatoni Artist, my beloved Susan from IHS, because I could not do these things without Susan. So it's definitely a community effort, and that's something, quite frankly, Conner Prairie never attempted to do. So it opens, like I said, in 2024, so I hope you come and see what I attempted to do.
And quickly, you mentioned that you have a book coming out. I don't know if you told us when it would be released and available, so maybe you could.
It will be available this time in next year, 2024, on the University of North Carolina Press. Right now, the title is Confined Femininity, Race, Gender, and Incarceration in Kentucky, 1865 to 1920. The marketing team at UNC Press might change the title, but that's what it is right now.
Okay. Well, it's 8:30. The lights are flickering. I told you the ancestors were with us tonight. I think they're out there operating the circuit breakers, telling us it's time to wrap it up. I would like you to give a big hand to our panelists tonight and to our moderator. I want to thank you for being here. We are going to break. The weather looks like it's acting funky again. So there is, I'd like to ask the authors who have books available to, if you would like to buy the books, they are available in the tent for purchase. And I think Steve and Warren will be happy to sign those books for you. So please support authors. We really appreciate that. And obviously, Charlene, when your book is ready, we'll do it again. Sorry. I was reserving you for Saturday, but we also have Ms. Olivia Bundle here's with us tonight, and her book on about Madam C.J. Walker on her own ground is also available, and it will be available for family who will be here for the reunion on Saturday as well. So I think Olivia will be happy to sign some books tonight as well. So please support our authors, and be careful out here. We'll keep an eye on the weather. And, sorry? I'm not reading the signals very well.
Congratulations, Celeste.
Oh, I did as part of it, but I'll do it again. Thank you again, Celeste, for moderating our panel tonight. Yeah, there's the survey cards. Please fill out the survey cards, both sides. There's demographic information on the front and survey about the program on the back. So please fill them out. Our funders will be very happy if we give them your evaluations back as part of this project tonight. Yes. No, I don't think the shirts are available tonight. We'll have them at the homecoming. We had to kind of limit how many things we had going on tonight. So please come back on either Friday, tomorrow night or Saturday, and you will get that. Good night. Thank you so much, audience, for being here. You've been wonderful. Appreciate it.